Thank you, Hannah, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you to Hillsdale College for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor. One of the most beautiful things written during the American founding, in fact, one of the most beautiful things written ever, is George Washington's 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. Washington had visited Newport in August of 1790 and met with many groups of citizens, including members of the Truro synagogue. Shortly after his visit, one of the leaders of the Jewish community there, a man named Moses Seixas, writing on behalf of the congregation, sent Washington a nice letter thanking him for his visit and congratulating him on his conduct as president. Washington wrote back in turn a very memorable letter. And I want to read the whole thing since it's relatively short and deserving of our full attention. I'll read it from this lovely book that Hillsdale College has put out called Constitution, a Reader, which is full of wonderful documents from the founding era. If you don't have one, I encourage you to get one. This is Washington's letter in reply. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I received in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger, which are past, is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have the wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased by your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our path, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. It's quite a letter, I think. The principle of religious liberty enshrined in the American founding, which Washington magnificently summarizes in this letter, was one of the greatest accomplishments in human history. Yet, can we say that the United States lives up to Washington's hope today? We've all seen the vicious anti-Semitism on display at many college campuses. Not this one, thank God. But at many campuses, protests over the war in Gaza include despicable acts of intimidation and violence against Jewish students. Can we claim that what Washington prayed for in 1790, that everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree and there shall be none to make him afraid, still obtains today? Of course, the principle of religious liberty is now under assault not only against Jews, but against Christians as well. In innumerable ways, American Christians and Jews find their faith mocked and threatened by an aggressively secular, even atheistic, ruling class. I'd like to share with you some thoughts and reflections on this precious gift of religious liberty, which we seem to be in danger of losing. and talk a little bit about where the idea came from and why it took almost 2,000 years for Christianity to put this idea into practice. We're going to jump into a sort of a time machine and hop back and forth a little bit to look at certain key moments in the history of Western civilization. And our first stop will be 12th century England, where we will examine the confrontation between King Henry II and St. Thomas Becket. This confrontation was an important milestone in the slow development of religious liberty. Becket lived from 1118 to 1170, so his contribution to our story occurs almost 400 years before Martin Luther kicked off the Protestant Reformation in 1517, which was about 2 decades before King Henry VIII established the Church of England in 1534. Now, I want you to get your money's worth from this lecture, so we're going to have a little audio-visual segment and watch a short scene from the classic 1964 film, Becket. If you've never seen it, maybe this clip will induce you to go rent it from Netflix or someplace. It's really a marvelous movie. And it stars Richard Burton as Thomas Becket and Peter O'Toole as King Henry II. Becket and the king had been very close friends and confidants, but their friendship, as we will see in a moment, had become strained by a huge battle over the question of religious versus political authority, and whether the church could be or should be independent of the king. In the scene we're about to watch in a moment, Becket is the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest-ranking religious figure in England, which, of course, at this point still means Catholicism. Becket is in exile in France, having fled King Henry's wrath because he refuses to submit to the king's authority over the church. Now, in this scene, again, Richard Burton as Becket, Peter O'Toole as King Henry, and John Gielgud in a marvelous cameo role as the Pope lay out their essential dispute. So if we could roll the video clip, I'll make some remarks after that's done.
Go, Thomas. You know, it's a strange thing, but Becket's safety has become quite dear to me. You look older, Thomas.
So do you, my prince. You cold?
I'm frozen stiff. Chilblains are killing me. You love it, of course. You're in your element, aren't you? Just that monk's habit.
I always told you one must fight the cold with the cold's weapons. Strip yourself naked every morning and splash yourself with cold water.
I used to. When you were there to make me. I never wash now, I stink.
How's your son? He must have come of age.
He's an idiot and sly like his mother. Thomas, don't you ever marry.
You took that matter out of my hands when you had me ordained.
If we start on that, we're sure to quarrel. Talk about something else.
Very well. Has your Majesty done much hunting lately?
Yes, every day. It doesn't amuse me anymore. Becket, I'm bored.
My prince, I wish I could help you.
What are you waiting for?
For the honor of God and the honor of the king to become one.
That may take long.
Yes. That may take long.
I'm the king, Thomas. And so long as we are on this earth, you owe me the first move. I'm prepared to forget a lot of things, but not the fact that I am king. You yourself taught me that.
Never forget it, my prince. You have a different task to do. You have to steer the ship.
And you? What do you have to do?
To resist you with all my might when you steer against the Lord God.
What do you expect of me then? Are you hoping I'll weaken?
No. I'm afraid we must only do, absurdly, what it has been given to us to do. Right to the end.
Look, suppose we come down to earth and use words that make sense to a boor like myself. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere. And there'll be two frozen statues trying to make their peace in a frozen eternity.
My lord, I was doing my best to make you understand.
I'm an idiot, then. Talk to me like an idiot. Will you lift the excommunication you pronounced on Lord Gilbert?
No, because it's the only weapon I have left to defend what was given into my care.
Will you agree to the 10 proposals which the bishops accepted in your absence? Particularly to the surrender of priests who seek the protection of the church to escape my courts of justice?
No. My role is to defend my sheep, and they are my sheep. But I shall agree to the 9 other articles in a spirit of peace, and because I know you must remain king in all and of all, save the honor of God.
All right. I will give way on this one point, in memory of our past friendship. You may return to England.
Thank you, my prince. I meant to go back in any case and give myself up to your power. For in all things that concern this earth, I owe you obedience.
We've finished now. And I'm cold.
I feel cold too. Now.
You never loved me, did you, Thomas?
Insofar as I was capable of love, yes, I did.
Did you start to love God? You mule! Answer a simple question!
Yes. I started to love the honor of God.
I should never have seen you. It hurts too much.
My prince.
No! No pity. It's dirty. This is the last time I shall come begging to you. Go back to England.
Farewell, my prince. I sail tomorrow. I know that I shall never see you again.
How dare you say that to me when I've given you my royal word? Do you take me for a traitor?
All right, so that you can gather the gist of their dispute from that scene. The solution to the dilemma we just saw there might seem clear to us. The king has his authority, and the church its authority, and these are separate. The king oversees worldly matters, the church has sovereignty in the spiritual realm. There can be peace and harmony when each authority, political and ecclesiastical, recognizes the authority and independence of the other. But this solution, which seems so obvious to us, was not obvious in the 12th century, or at least not completely so. We see here the beginnings of religious liberty, or the beginnings of a practical solution to the theological-political problem, but only the beginnings. To understand why it would take another 600 years to put that solution into practice, we need to go back into our time machine and travel back a little further, actually another millennium and a half, to the ancient world, the pre-Christian world. As with so many things, the past is the secret to understanding the present. This is another reason to study history and philosophy. You can't understand the modern world without looking to its roots in Jerusalem and Athens and Rome. The most important fact about the ancient world for our purposes is that prior to Christianity, all religions were emphatically political. Now, what do I mean by that? A few verses from the Old Testament can help us understand the point. Many of you will know this passage from Exodus 20. Quote, "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God." We also read in the Bible of God's special covenant with the Jews, who are repeatedly described in the Old Testament as God's chosen people. Now, what's interesting is that all the ancient tribes or nations considered themselves chosen people, chosen and protected by their own local gods. Whether it was Apollo and the other Olympian gods in Sparta, Marduk and Nabu for the Babylonians, Ra and Isis and Osiris in Egypt, or Jehovah among the Jews, the gods of the ancient world were always particular. The gods were always the gods of some specific people. That is what I mean by saying that religion in the ancient world was always political. In this respect, Jerusalem was like all the other cities in the classical world. It was unique in one respect. Israel was monotheistic. The Hebrew God was, or I should say is, singular, mysterious, and omnipotent. He was the God of the whole world. In that sense, Judaism obviously prepared the way for the first truly universal religion, Christianity. But the ancient Israelites did not proselytize or seek converts. In fact, no pre-Christian city, including Jerusalem, wanted to share its gods. Unlike Israel, the other ancient nations typically had a pantheon of gods, pagan gods. But apart from this important qualification, the story of the Israelites, their way of life, is basically the same as what we find all over the Mediterranean. All ancient cities, including Jerusalem, were closed societies where civil and religious obedience were identical. All law was divine law. To be a good citizen meant to be a pious worshiper of the city's gods. There was no such thing as religious toleration or religious pluralism. That was unthinkable. Priests were public officials, and the distinction between church and state was incomprehensible. Every city had its own god or gods which belonged to them alone and which protected its chosen people. To defeat another nation in war meant to defeat its gods. Even this militant and somewhat bloodthirsty aspect of the ancient world shows up to some degree in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 7, we read, quote, "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them." And then a little later in Deuteronomy 12, "Ye shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire. And ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of that place." Now, this is what the New York Times might call extremist rhetoric. But in fact, it was perfectly normal in the ancient world, and it was how all the tribes of the classical world viewed their enemies, as unclean heretics who had to be destroyed because they worshipped false and hateful gods. Now, just to belabor this point a little bit further, I want to emphasize one key aspect of ancient religion that's absolutely essential, and it is, in a way, the central point of my whole presentation about religious liberty and where it came from and why it took so long to put into practice. In the pre-Christian world, and again, I'm speaking of Western civilization, not China or India, the authority of the law always came from God or the gods. The laws were absolutely binding and sacred because they came directly from a divine authority. You all know the story of Moses descending from Mount Sinai with the tablets. God directly and immediately issued his commandments to his people. And each people had its own divine commandments, which came from its particular gods. That means that Moses' authority as a political leader also came directly from God. And this was true, again, for all the ancient cities. Plato's longest dialogue, even longer than the Republic, is called the Laws. And the very first word of that dialogue is God. The main character, who is a kind of Socrates in disguise, is on a pilgrimage, walking to a Greek holy site. And he asks his two traveling companions, one from Sparta and one from Crete, "Where do your laws come from, you Spartan and you Cretan? From a man or a god?" And both answer, "A god, of course." God is always the source of all law, all political authority. And there is no distinction between between religious and civic obligation. To be a good citizen meant to obey the sacred law. Every ancient city, every polis, if you know this Greek word, understood itself to be a holy city. So if we're clear on that, let's jump back into the time machine and return to 12th century England and meet up again with Thomas Becket and King Henry. When Henry II, in the film clip we just saw, rejected any distinction between political and religious authority and believed that he could supervise the clergy and he could enforce the canon law, he was relying on a very old tradition. King Henry thought that piety and citizenship go together because his authority came directly from God. And he believed, for the very good reason that people had always believed that. Of course, political authority came from God. Where else could it come from? And of course, the law commanded both the body and the soul, because morality includes both. How could you attempt to separate the obligations of piety from the obligations of citizenship? Good citizens are good people, and therefore they obey the law, which is not some invention of self-interest or utility, but reflects the commands issued by God. Yet, as we saw in the film, this approach, this attitude, creates as many problems as it solves. About 100 years after Becket, another Thomas, St. Thomas Aquinas, would start to develop the philosophical distinctions between the ecclesiastical and the political realms. But this was also very preliminary and strictly theoretical. That distinction would not, as I've mentioned, have any practical effect until the American founding. Both Thomases, Becket and Aquinas, were wrestling with a problem that did not exist in the ancient world. They were confronting a problem created by Christianity. Now, let me be clear, I don't mean to say that Christianity itself, as a faith, is a problem, but only that from the point of view of political philosophy, from the perspective of how political obligation had always been understood, it presents a problem. In fact, several. Of course, in one sense, the fact that Christianity complicated things should not be surprising. The incarnation changed the world. And Jesus himself says, "I bring not peace, but the sword." So what exactly were these political difficulties that Christianity introduced? Let me first clarify that the political problems were actually created by two factors, two massive, monumental events and their confluence: the biblical monotheism of the New Testament plus the rise of the Roman Empire. When the old Roman Republic ended with Julius Caesar, the new Roman Empire became the universal city, the regime of the whole Mediterranean world. All the small independent tribes of the old ancient world were incorporated into a single regime, a single empire. And when Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, the old unity was restored. One regime, one God, one law. So far, so good. The union between citizenship and piety holds. But when Rome is sacked by the Visigoths, and the empire collapses in the 4th century, a real dilemma emerges, actually 3 dilemmas, which would not be resolved for more than a millennium. Problem 1. The collapse of Rome leaves one God but many regimes, many kingdoms. For the first time in Western civilization, religious and civil authority become separated. That is to say, the divine and the civil law are no longer the same. All of Europe belongs to one church, but is split into many principalities, under many rulers. Citizens confront for the first time the challenge of dual allegiance. They were required to obey both their king and their pope. But what if those two disagree? We saw an indication of that in the film. What if your prince tells you something different from your priest? This political schizophrenia, as we might call it, was something new. Problem 2. What is the source of political authority? Why should anyone obey the law? Remember that in the ancient city, the laws come directly from God. Moses literally brought the commandments down from Mount Sinai. The Spartans likewise believed their laws came directly from Apollo, and so on in all the ancient cities. But where did the Prince of Bavaria, for example, in the year 1200, get his authority? The solution the Europeans came up with is something you've all heard of, the doctrine of divine right of kings. This was an attempt to reconnect civil and divine authority. And that was necessary because, as all the ancient cities understood, the laws must be sacred in order to command obedience. Political authority must have some supernatural foundation. But what divine right of kings means in practice is hereditary monarchy as a religious and political necessity. If the king's ancestors received their authority directly from God, as the idea of divine right holds, then only the king's direct descendants can exercise that authority. This causes enormous problems for the question of succession, monarchical succession. What if the king has no legitimate heirs? Or what if the only heir is totally unqualified to rule? We saw the comment in the film in which Henry says his son is an idiot. This sort of problem happened. And what if a nephew or a cousin, someone with a partial claim on the throne, is far more qualified? Well, we know what happens, because it did happen over and over again, as anyone familiar with the history of England can tell you. Civil war. Many of Shakespeare's history plays examine these issues. As my teacher, Harry Jaffa, liked to say, the doctrine of divine right of kings never finds a way to combine legitimacy with competence. Again, this was not a problem that the ancient world had to deal with. Problem 3, the content of belief, or the question of doctrine, becomes incredibly important in a way that was not the case in the classical world. Recall what I said earlier about the paramount importance of law. Now, it would be an exaggeration to say that what you privately believed in the ancient cities was irrelevant. That would be too strong. But there was very little investigation into private matters of conscience. Socrates only got into trouble because he was so vocal and so obnoxious about questioning the sacred opinions of the Athenians. Because all ancient religions were political, what was overwhelmingly important was that you demonstrate your loyalty to the community and its gods by obeying the divine law, by participating in the public ceremonies, by performing the appropriate rituals. This outward expression of piety, showing that you were a good citizen of Sparta or Jerusalem, that's what mattered. In Christianity, of course, belief becomes paramount. And this opens the door to persecution in a way that you simply didn't have in the pre-Christian world. Even before the Reformation, which ushered in centuries of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, the problem of doctrine was already present in terms of heresy. Early on, the church had to spend centuries hammering out the precise content of the catechism. Gnosticism, Arianism, Pelagianism, and many other heresies had to be investigated and then declared to be errors. And of course, since these errors undermined the faith, they could not be tolerated and had to be stamped out. So the issue of religious persecution emerges as yet another challenge. You may know that during the Spanish Inquisition, the church determined what constituted deviation from the faith, and the state then imposed the punishment. But these lines were not so easy to maintain, and the problem of theocracy or some variation on theocracy was a constant danger in medieval Europe. These difficulties, which Western civilization struggled with for hundreds of years all through the Middle Ages, emerged because Christianity is the first non-political religion of the West. To reiterate, being a Christian is not a question of what political community you belong to, what your tribe is, but a matter of choice, of faith, of belief. That is incredibly liberating, of course. It means salvation is potentially open to every human being. But it creates all the challenges that I've mentioned for politics and citizenship. Now, one more trip in our time machine for our last stop, which will bring us to the American colonies in the 1770s. And I think at this point, we're in a better position to appreciate the challenges that the American founders faced. The problem of establishing Republican self-government included, at the most fundamental, this complicated issue, the title of my talk, the theological-political problem. And I've tried to lay out what that problem meant in the Christian West. The American founders had to figure out first how to create moral and political legitimacy for a new nation, and at the same time, establish the sacredness of the law, which alone can command people's devotion and obedience, and address the problem of religious conflict and persecution that had plagued Europe. A pretty difficult set of challenges, I think. And the answer they came up with is right there in the Declaration of Independence, as you all know. The laws of nature and nature's God. I think we don't always appreciate the genius of this revolutionary truth, which manages to combine in a prudential way human reason and divine revelation, and thereby provide the best practical solution to the theological-political problem possible in the modern world. The founders' political science or political theory, grounded in the laws of nature and nature's God, made it possible for the first time in history to establish religious liberty and solve the theological-political problem in a practical way. Incidentally, I might add that the final version of the Declaration says that the truths derived from the laws of nature are self-evident. But in Jefferson's first draft, he had written sacred and undeniable, and it was Benjamin Franklin who had suggested the new language. I think this indicates that the framers knew they were grappling with the theological-political problem, and they understood that their efforts could be traced back to Jerusalem and to Athens. The laws of nature and nature's God mean that there is an objective moral order in the world, because that world is created by a benevolent God. Because God is reasonable, and because our minds are a gift from God which he intends us to use, we can perceive much of this moral order through our own rational faculties. We can't know those things that come only from revelation, including the first table of the Decalogue. Aristotle, who lived hundreds of years before Christ, could not know about keeping the Sabbath holy, but he could know the precepts of the second table of the Decalogue, the commandments about theft and murder and honoring one's parents. And that's why Aristotle's book on ethics is almost perfectly compatible with the morality proclaimed in the Bible. There are some minor differences on the questions of piety and pride, but we can set those aside. They don't affect the main point. Let me add that this natural moral order exists outside of our will. It exists whether we like it or not. We are born into a physical and a moral world we do not create. However much today's leftists think that they can command or alter human nature, for example, by allowing children to choose gender reassignment surgery, this will never work, and it will never lead to true happiness because we cannot change human nature. Now, all of this is extremely significant for the question of religious liberty because the laws of nature and nature's God become the new ground for political authority. And they supply the law with its sacred and transcendent authority. This allows the principles of the founding to address all three of the problems I mentioned earlier. First, it solves the problem of political schizophrenia, the split between piety and citizenship, by supplying a common ground for morality. Because, as Aristotle showed, we can understand virtue and vice through our own rational faculties, the law can support and enforce moral precepts that are acknowledged by both political and ecclesiastical authorities. In other words, because the morality of the Bible and the morality of reason are compatible, one can be both a pious believer and a good citizen without invoking the contentious sectarian disputes that tore Europe apart. Second, because of this common ground of morality, it is now finally possible to clearly delineate the political and the religious realms. The separation of church and state becomes possible as a practical matter for the first time, which we can see most clearly in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Bill for Religious Freedom of 1786. The Declaration's teaching about the laws of nature and nature's God establishes a kind of political theology, a non-sectarian ground of legitimacy that can make the laws sacred without getting the government involved in disputes about the Trinity or transubstantiation or faith versus works. According to many Protestant ministers during the founding era, this also allows what they called true Christianity to flourish for the first time, because it is now possible to practice Christianity with a free and loving heart, as a choice, rather than as a matter of coercion. And you can find this point made in many sermons from the founding era. Third, the founders solved the problem of religious persecution. Because the government and the churches can agree on a moral code that is compatible with both reason and revelation, each can now operate within its proper realm without intruding on the other. It becomes possible, therefore, to institutionalize religious liberty by prohibiting religious tests for office and keeping the government out of the business of punishing heresy. As George Washington said in the letter that I read at the beginning, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, giving it on all occasions their effectual support. The American founders' invocation of the transcendent moral authority of nature is one of the most remarkable acts of statesmanship in human history. And providing a ground for religious liberty is only one way in which the laws of nature and nature's God serve the cause of self-government. If I had more time, I could discuss how eliminating religious persecution also grants freedom to philosophy. That is, it protects the metaphysical freedom of the human mind. We could also talk about how prohibiting religious coercion goes hand in hand with the founders' elimination of artificial class distinctions and allows for what Jefferson called true aristocracy to emerge. That is, the aristocracy of merit, in contrast to the artificial aristocracy of birth in old Europe. The old medieval caste system and the old structures of theocratic oppression were great impediments to human excellence. Under the founders' revolutionary new conception of republican government, equality under the law would liberate moral virtue, while freedom of conscience liberates intellectual virtue. Now, I recognize that I've covered a great deal of historical and intellectual ground, and we can discuss some of the details in the Q&A. I hope I've given you some sense of the problems the founders confronted and the brilliance of their practical solution. The question which we and all American patriots confront today is whether we still understand and appreciate this incredible gift left to us by the founders. Do we still have the knowledge and the courage to keep alive the sacred fire of liberty? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ellmers has agreed to sign copies of his book, The Soul of Politics, directly after the session in the Searle lobby. We now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to a microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Everything was so clear, there are no questions.
Hello, and thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned at the end that the old caste system prevented people from achieving excellence. And though I agree with that point, Tocqueville argued that it was the old aristocracy that actually allowed for great education and for true nobility, and that's how people became great philosophers. And Americans don't really have any good philosophers or people of great genius. That's his argument anyway. How would you respond to that?
Sure, it's interesting. I just wrote an article on Tocqueville, which was just published in the New Criterion. Tocqueville had many brilliant insights. He was a brilliant man. He didn't quite understand everything about America. It's important to remember Tocqueville studied democracy in America because he wanted to understand democracy as a kind of phenomenon, as a kind of historical force, and then learn how France could deal with it. And so he missed a couple important things about how democracy operates in America. He was right. I mean, he thought that there was a kind of aristocratic spirit in Europe that, the life of the gentleman, the life of the leisure gentleman who can pursue knowledge for its own sake, that gets overclipsed a little bit in the frenetic entrepreneurial activity of democratic capitalism. So he had a fair point. But I think he overstated some things, and I think Jefferson's understanding I think the founders' own self-understanding was not as hostile to excellence as Tocqueville suggested. On the contrary, Jefferson's whole point about allowing the aristocracy of merit, the natural aristocracy, to emerge is precisely so that human beings could pursue excellence without the artificial inhibitions that you saw in the old European aristocracy.
Dr. Ellmers, thank you for your enlightening lecture. My question relates to whether or not the theological-political problem really, in the solving of it by the founders, really relates to Christianity. It solves it insofar as it allows for Christianity or a kind of Christianity to be congruent with political life. Because it seems as though there are ultimately still claims made by the state contra certain religious teachings that have to be taken into account, and one has to be supreme over the other. In the American context, it seems an older and a newer issue would be Mormonism and Islam, both religions that in their religious teachings, for instance, allow polygamy. And that's something that ultimately the state has to adjudicate, whether that's going to be allowed or not. So I'm wondering if my understanding is correct, that's what you're referring to as Christianity, and politics can go together under the founder's scheme, or whether there's some way that all religions can work under the founder's scheme. Thank you.
Well, not all religions. The religion of Moloch, the religion of the Aztecs, which included human sacrifice, and even in some cases, they had a problem with Mormon polygamy, and they certainly would have had a problem with the extreme versions of Sharia that we see. So this goes back to the point I made about the compatibility between the virtue that we can understand through our natural reason and the morality of the Bible. It's only insofar as they are compatible that you can have a society, a Christian society in which Christian morality flourishes. Any interpretation of Christianity or any other religion which undermines just government, which undermines a decent society, that is a problem. And it is both the right and the duty of the state to prohibit that. So insofar as someone interprets Christianity in a way that undermines public morality or is in some way offensive, or any other religion promotes things that are offensive to natural decency and natural morality, it is the obligation of the government to prohibit those things. Yeah.
So if the sacredness of American law comes from the idea that nature was created by a God and you can therefore know certain truths sort of a posteriori, is there any basis for following law or any basis that the law is sacred in a society that's atheistic entirely?
Yeah, that's a real problem. My teacher's teacher, who was a famous political philosopher named Leo Strauss, once said, now he said this in the middle of the last century, in the 1950s or 60s, there's never been a completely atheistic society in the history of the world. If he had lived a little longer, he might have changed his mind when he saw the contemporary United States. But I think, as my remarks indicated, it's not working. You know, I wrote a little book in which I claim that wokeism and, you know, political correctness and this weird ideology that the left has is in a way their deranged substitute for religion. I think there's something built into the human soul that requires a need for the sacred, a need for the transcendent. And if you reject that, something has to fill the hole in your soul. And it becomes whatever weird paganistic belief wokeism is, right? But people have to believe in something. And so I think it is true that no society can be completely atheistic, and if it tries, it simply substitutes something else. What is that great line from G.K. Chesterton? When people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything, right? And so that's trying to achieve the atheistic society, trying to achieve an atheistic society just opens you up to believing all sorts of crazy things instead.
So my question is about priests or somebody who has some sort of theological authority, and whether there'd be a way that they can hold political office or interact politically as well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So like a minister being elected to Congress?
Perhaps. I don't know. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that for the theological-political.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's an absolute rule against it. You know, the founders, although they agreed on a great deal, did have some minor differences on some things, and how exactly the religious liberty is supposed to work, you know, on the ground, in the details, is a complicated question, and it requires some use of prudence as circumstances change. If you're interested in this question, I take it you're a student. A friend of mine who I went to grad school with, who's a professor at Notre Dame named Philip Munoz, has written what I think is one of the best books on religious liberty, and he explores how there were some differences among the founders. I think Jefferson, for example, would not have appreciated having a clergyman holding elective office. Madison might have been, you know, more open to that. These are difficult questions, and I'm reluctant to say that there's a hard and fast rule. I think what they agreed on is the important point, right? No religious test for office, no persecution. On the other hand, there's no obligation, no public obligation to accept religious practices that are clearly indecent or immoral. On some of the finer points, I'll beg off and say that requires a statesmanly exercise of prudence to decide in the moment. But read Phil's book. I think you'll find it a much more nuanced response to your question.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk, Journey Through Time. It seems like secular America is, in principle, is held together by the judiciary, and it's working or not. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. You know, the judiciary is the third branch of government. It was supposed to have, according to the Federalist Papers, neither force nor will, and yet it seems that we're ruled by the Supreme Court. And it's also weird I just mentioned this, oddly enough, a week and a half ago when I was down at Ellmers giving a talk for Constitution Day, that all the populists and advocates of direct democracy who want to get rid of the Electoral College and all these impediments to the direct expression of popular will have, in a way, reversed the Electoral College, and we now elect presidents and a senator whose main job is to pick the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules us. So we pick the president and the president and the Senate pick the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules us. That's not how it's supposed to work, needless to say. So how we got to that point is a very strange story. It does affect, it creates all sorts of problems, including in the area of religious liberty. Another virtue of Professor Munoz's book, which I just mentioned a moment ago, is he looks at some of the Supreme Court jurisprudence and brings out all the ways in which it's had a very inconsistent approach to the very important questions of religious liberty. But yeah, the simple answer to your question is everything is completely upside down in the country right now, and one of those manifestations is that the court seems to be the ruling branch, which is the exact opposite of what Madison intended.
Hi, I've worked as a clinical psychologist for 30 years, and identity emerges all the time. And in order to form a healthy identity, morality is necessary because the human condition is about the tension between what I am and what I need to be. Could you please comment about the necessity of that morality?
Right. I mean, in a way, that's a kind of corollary, to the point of the atheistic society, right? I mean, a lot of people think that they're, avatars of the Enlightenment, they're beyond morality, but just like the atheistic society ends up believing in all sorts of crazy things, people who think they're beyond morality end up substituting a kind of ersatz or degraded or deranged form of morality in its place, even though they don't recognize it as such, right? I think if you go to Berkeley and talk to some purple-haired sociology grad student, right, she might tell you, if you can understand her through all the piercings in her face, I don't believe in morality. But of course, that's bogus. She believes in all sorts of morality, right? She's extremely eager to impose her morality on you, even though she doesn't call it that, right? So people can't live with a spiritual hole in their soul, and they can't live without morality. And if they try to repudiate it, they just end up putting something else in its place, which is more than likely to be something weird and deranged and counterproductive.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Ellmers. I actually study theology and religion at John Carroll Society, and I've really been quite interested in your research, so I appreciate very much this opportunity to hear you in person. So John Courtney Murray argues that freedom of religion being enshrined in our Constitution is protected in a pluralist society. And I'm curious, as we continue to move forward in this postmodernist society where religion is only guaranteed a place at a table in the name of tolerance, if you still think his theology holds true.
John Courtney Murray's point?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's obviously the answer is yes. Look, all of us here on the right are concerned about the crisis in the West, the crisis in America. The whole country seems to be sort of coming apart at the seams under the intense pressures. And there's two problems. And one is the institutional problem, and this sort of came up with the gentleman's question about the court. We have to fix the institutions of government, which are all out of whack. But the other problem, and the more difficult problem, and what John Courtney Murray is sort of pointing to, and it's interesting, John Carroll, people may not know this, John Carroll was the first bishop in the United States. His brother, they were a very wealthy family in Maryland. One brother signed the Declaration of Independence. One was the first Catholic bishop in the United States. But the other point is, even if we fix the institutions, we have to fix the people, right? The founders were emphatic. You cannot have self-government without a moral people. And moral generally means, by and large, religious people, right? And if people lose their attachment to religion and lose their attachment to morality, they cannot have the habits and the virtues that make self-government work. Now, how to fix the institutions, that's a big challenge. How to fix this other problem, right? How to bring the people back to the moral habits and virtues necessary for self-government, I don't have a simple answer to that. But we need to do both, as difficult as that sounds.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ellmers.